Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Market Values, the Transfermarkt podcast that tells you the value of a player and why that really matters. And today, me, Stefan Bienkowski, your host, I'm delighted to be joined by Manu Veth, my colleague over in Vancouver in Canada, who is the area manager for North America. Now, Manu couldn't join us on episode 1 because he was too busy skiing and putting his feet up. But he's back at work and I've dragged him in front of his camera to take part in the show. Manu, you're going to be joining us frequently on this show as we kind of explore the world of football through Transfermarkt and through market values. But how are you doing, buddy? We obviously know each other very well. But say hello to the listeners.
Yeah, hey, really happy to finally get this project on my end going. As you mentioned, I was off last week and much needed rest. Glad to be back on now. This is a really exciting time for us at Transfermarkt. March is when we do the first market value updates of the year, of the calendar year, not the season, the calendar year. Depending on where you are in the world, it might be also the first of the season, right? Because like I have MLS, for example, it's actually the first of the season. We have Marcus on later on the show, and for him it's also the first of the season. But yeah, this is a really busy time and kind of going through it all. And I'm really interested in talking about how we kind of put them all together. That's, I think, a big part of what we do in the show, but not the only thing we're going to do on the show. We're going to also do all sorts of other stuff, and I'm just really excited to finally get it going, Stefan.
Yeah, so on episode 1, we did touch on the Premier League market value update, and we also went to Turkey with the Super League update with Lara Karacan, our colleague, and Ben Littlemore from the Premier League update, of course. So if you missed those episodes, by all means, go back and have a listen to those if you want to catch up on those leagues. But on today's show, Manu, as you mentioned, you sat down with Marcus Watts, who's our Brazil area manager. You guys talked about the change in role in Brazilian football, which is a very, very exciting topic. The risk of young players departing Brazilian football too early and heading off to Europe, but also the sheer amount of money that's now flown into Brazilian football and how that's now prolonging the careers of Brazilian players. I wrote an article actually back in January looking at the money going into Brazilian football, and I was staggered to find that the Brazilian top flights actually spent more money than any other league in the world in 2026, except for the Premier League. So, very changed days there. And of course, not to mention, because it was the market value update, you guys chatted about the exciting young players who are coming up in market value and some of the biggest drop-offs as well. But, I mean, I'll just throw it to you. You're the one who sat down with Marcus. How did you find the chat with him?
Yeah, it's so insightful. As I said, when I was talking to him, Brazilian football is having a moment. There's very high transfer fees paid, although whether that money always arrives is a different story. That one that Marcos and I'm thinking of doing a future podcast on it, the paying morale of Brazilian clubs when it comes to actually executing those transfer fees is a little different than the fees that show up on the side. But as I said, it's a different story, and it is without a doubt true that, the Lucas Paqueta deal is one that was one of the biggest of the winter. Him going back to Flamengo, right, for a significant transfer fee was a massive story. Market values are going up, and before we recorded this, I finished writing the Argentina market value update, and it's such a different story to Argentina, where market values are really trending down. It's a league in big peril, where there is not that much money available. And then right next to it, and these are two countries that are such massive rivals, there's a complete opposite story going on with Brazil, which is, of course, such a fascinating thing. And throughout history, it's gone kind of back and forward between those two leagues in South America dominating. And it is very much true that Brazil is now the dominant league and country when it comes to producing football players, but also maintaining those football players in the country. And that is a huge change. And it's kind of bounced back to what it was in the 1990s, right? Where they also were able to bring back players like Romario and Edmundson, and so these kind of guys for significant fees. And they are probably now at a level where they can say, hey, we're just outside of the top 5 European leagues. It's now a viable pathway again for players to play there. And I think that is something that we really tried to stress when we talked about the market value update, because while it's true that there's a lot of upgrades, a lot of these upgrades were for players that are in their early 20s and were already in Europe at some point, then come back, and now are kind of underlining this trend that maybe it's not the best idea always to go at a very young age. So a really fascinating discussion. I think it was really good.
Yeah. And of course, the Argentina market value update, which you mentioned there, is out today, Wednesday, which Manu's obviously said he wrote. So you can find that on our website on transfermarkt.com.us.co.uk, whichever, wherever you are in the world, I suppose. And of course, as we mentioned as well, we did also do La Liga, which came out on Monday, our big market value update of La Liga. We sat down with Tobias Kroger, who is our market value coordinator, and we had a really interesting chat about some big downgrades at Real Madrid and one notable upgrade at Barcelona. One player really coming to the fore and kind of living up to his potential, and not to mention a real kind of feel-good story, if you will, at Betis, unless you're a bitter Manchester United fan. So that was very interesting as well. But Manu, before we get into all of that, I want to touch on a really interesting story that happened over the weekend. I think it's also an interesting story because it touches on why our market values are so interesting and so kind of pertinent and relevant. And that, of course, is an incredible story in the Premier League where Max Dowman became the Premier League's youngest ever goal scorer in Arsenal's 2-0 win over Everton. Dowman's an interesting player because he not only became the Premier League's youngest ever goal scorer and ironically overtook an Everton player to take that title, but he's a player that we've been keeping an eye on at Transfermarkt for a while now. He got his first ever market value back in December when he was awarded a €20 million market value. So that's his first ever market value at the start of his career. And I think that's really relevant because it was the fifth highest market value we've ever given to a player for their first ever market value. And as people can see when they see on the screen here, he's now the fifth highest, as I mentioned there, just below Callum Hudson-Odoi, who was awarded €25 million in 2019, and then Gavi and Fati at Barcelona, who were both awarded €25 million themselves in 2021 and 2019. And perhaps most recently, Lamine Yamal, who was awarded a €25 million market value in 2023. And he's certainly gone up some way since then. You could probably stick an extra zero on that, and that's closer to where he is now, which we'll touch on later in the show. I think this is really interesting right now, Manu, because not only is Dowman the most valuable player born in 2009, but he sits alongside another player in Germany, a very exciting talent in Kennet Eichhorn, the Hertha Berlin midfielder. He's also been given a market value of €20 million, exact same age. And you know a bit about him, so I thought really good opportunity to not only shine a light on Dowman and his market value and the way that he's breaking records, but also how he's already maybe got this interesting rivalry with a midfielder in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting how they got there, right? Eichhorn got his first market value in August 2025 as a 16-year-old, and the market value was just €3 million, and then it very quickly materialized that was a little low because of the way he was playing in the Zweite Bundesliga for Hertha Berlin, a really big club in German football that is stranded in the second division and has always produced a lot of very exciting young players. Berlin sits alongside London and Paris in terms of the player pool, right? It's a very big city with a very big street footballing scene, a huge immigrant population, and that just breeds talent. That's just how it is. It's a very good environment for young players to come out, and Eichhorn is just the latest. He is from Berlin. He's a local talent. He's already been linked with all sorts of clubs. We had the Zweite Bundesliga market value update on last Friday. He did not go up in that one simply because, his benchmark was already so high. And we kind of have to see what his market is going to be in the summer. So there was no need to upgrade him. There's a lot of young players in that second division right now that have gotten significant upgrades, more so than in the past, because, Zweite Bundesliga is in a bigger focus when it comes to market value updates. But Eichhorn himself is a really fascinating player. I mean, the site that you are highlighting on our page, we can look up the most valuable players in terms of their U status, so like U19, U17, etc. But you can also look up the most valuable players born by year. And I love this site because I one of the things that I really like doing is highlighting young players, whether it is in the area that I work in North America, but also further afield, like who's the next big star coming up. And that list where he's on, where Eichhorn and Dowman dominate, this is the 2009 year group is the one that is going to write the next headlines, right? These are the kids that in 2 or 3 years we are going to talk the most about. And there's so many other great names on there. Like I look at Brian Madio from Aston Villa, Jerry Monga from Leicester, Marley Salmon from Arsenal. There's a young kid, Calvin Sullivan, US German player who plays for Philadelphia Union, who's already signed by Man City. This is a really cool page, and I always like it. And like Eichhorn is with Dowman, without a doubt, these are the players that we're going to talk about. And I think Dowman, correct me if I'm wrong, but he's at Arsenal. Like, where is he going to go? I mean, the moon, right? It's not like he's going to be a big story in terms of the transfer market and players going to try to sign him from Arsenal. Like, I mean, clubs might try, but the transfer fee that they would have to command to get him from a Premier League club would be significant. It's a completely different story for Eichhorn. I mean, Bayern Munich, Leipzig, Frankfurt, Premier League teams, they're already lining up to sign him. Where Hertha they have to sell him, right? So I think that's maybe where it diverges, that one of them has to make a career decision in the summer and the other one doesn't.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. I mean, I think the thing that really stands out with Dowman looking forward now as he is trying to break into that first team is that, yes, he's at Arsenal and yes, he's very highly regarded, but with all due respect to Arsenal, I would say they don't have a tremendous record of developing youth players under Mikel Arteta. Now, there's one obvious gold standard, and that is Bukayo Saka. And I think Dowman does draw a lot of comparisons to Saka, especially the way he kind of scored that goal the weekend, where he just dribbles through players with so much ease. He glides down the pitch with speed and technique. And Saka is undoubtedly the kind of, the real kind of gold standard, even though on last week's episode, we obviously spoke to Ben about how he's maybe struggling a little bit this season, but no one doubts that he'll be back on top in a matter of time. But there are some kind of cautionary tales. There's Nketiah, there's Balogun, maybe to an extent there's Miles Lewis-Skelly as well, who came through as a very exciting fullback / midfielder, and he's maybe really struggling to kind of live up to the initial buzz that he offered. So I think Dowman has to make sure that he can find a way to kind of avoid those pitfalls and kind of, find a way to kind of follow the kind of example that Bukayo Saka set. But yeah, as you said, Manu, you look at that list of the 2009 graduates, if you will, or the class of 2009, if you will, and Eichhorn and Dowman are definitely the ones who are standing out from it. They're almost twice as valuable, as you said, as third place player there. So yeah, it'll be a really interesting thing to keep an eye on. And obviously, as you guys are listening to the show, go check out their market values. And this is the fascinating thing about market values, Manu, isn't it? It's not only just a case of, people looking up who's the most valuable player here, who's the most valuable player there, but it's a time capsule, it's a timeline of shows how a player does over the course of their market value. And, just to kind of throw back up that kind of list of the most valuable players or the most valuable market values that every player had when they started, Dowman's fifth with 20 million. But, you've got Hudson-Odoi, who started off at 25 million euros, who's doing okay, but never really became the player he was expected to be. Gavi, who we touch upon in the chat with Tobias on the show, how his market value has actually dropped down to 30 million euros because of his struggles. Fati's another one at Barcelona who struggled as well. But then, of course, Yamal has done tremendously well at Barcelona. So there's no guarantee that a high market value at this stage of their career guarantees success.
No, there's not. I mean, Hudson-Odoi is probably the best example of that, right? His market value went straight to 25 million euros because at the time, Bayern Munich were willing to pay, I think, around 50 million euros to sign him straight from Chelsea, when he wasn't even a known entity, really, wasn't he? And that pushed up his market value initially up really high. Then he tore his Achilles, and he was never the same player again, right? And that, I think, is really what you have to kind of keep in mind with this. These careers are very much determined by fitness, especially at that level. And at 16, a lot can still happen. These are the most exciting players in the world right now in that age group. But there might be 10 years from now, someone who is in that age group who we don't even have on that list yet, who's going to be the most valuable. So that is, I think, something that you always have to keep in mind.
Yeah. Absolutely. So lots to keep an eye on with both those players and the other players mentioned on that list in the class of 2009. But I think we spoke for too long, Manu. Let's get into the real kind of meats and bones of this episode, and let's see what Marcus had to say when you chatted to him about the Brazilian market value update.
And joining me now is Marcus Watts, area manager Transfermarkt in Brazil. How's it going, Marcus?
Hey, Manu. Pleasure to be here. Busy days. Lots going on with Brazilian football, and obviously the market value updates here as well.
Yeah, I mean, and it's out now, right? We have the update was published last week. Lots of changes when I look at through the list of big changes at the very top. I mean, this was one of the craziest transfers this winter. Lucas Paqueta, I hope I pronounced that correctly. You can correct my pronunciation of Brazilian names anytime you want, buddy. But Lucas Paqueta going back to Flamengo was obviously a really big deal, and for a very long time he ranked number one among the most valuable players in the Brazilian Série A, together with Vitor Roque, right? But that's changed now. Vitor Roque, you guys decided to give him a €3 million update. That's an 8.6% increase in market value, and that ranks him alone at the very top. What was your thinking there?
Yeah, I mean, the Paqueta deal for Flamengo is a pretty big one, because not only it changes the whole perspective about the Brazilian market and how much money clubs here are willing to spend on players, but he gets to the league with that like spotlight on him, and everyone expects him to be one of the biggest stars here. But when we talk about Vitor Roque, we are talking about a 21 years old player who's been on the spotlight his whole career, and has been to Europe, and now he is expected to become Brazil's new number 9. I don't know if people remember, but at the time there was a lot of discussion between Endrick and Vitor Roque who would be Brazil's future number 9. They were both compared to players like Ronaldo or Pele or whatever. And today we sort of expect Vitor Roque to be this guy, at least in the first stage. It could be that in the future Endrick ends up being the number 9, or both could rotate as Brazil's number 9. But Vitor Roque is seen today as like one of the guys who should be at the next World Cup. And if he continues developing the way he is at the Palmeiras, he should be back at European football very soon. So today, if you compare him to Endrick, he's like one shelf above, we could say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, his profile is so very interesting. I remember when he broke through at Cruzeiro, right? And then he went to Atlético Paranaense. That was a little bit of a controversial deal as well, before ultimately heading across the Atlantic to Barcelona. And I mean, it's a little bit of a theme. Players that went very young to Europe and come back and have since excelled. The next guy that I want to talk about, and we'll get to him in a moment, has a similar kind of profile. But is Vitor Roque kind of really a good example of players maybe sometimes making that jump a little bit too early to one of the very big teams? I mean, we see players go from Brazil to Europe, but maybe not the top shelf clubs, as you said, like Barcelona, Real Madrid. Endrick is a good example. He went to Real Madrid. That jump is obviously too high at his age. And he's now excelling at Olympique Lyonnais. Is that like maybe just what happened here? He just made that jump a little bit too early.
Yeah, I mean, there is a big discussion about it. Some people would argue that players leave the country too early, and that's not the right thing to do. You should develop players like until they're like 20 here, and then they should be ready to go and join European sides. But in the meantime, you have the European clubs trying to get players as early as possible to develop them into their own system. So there's two sides of the coin there, and it's hard to argue who's right there. I think it's case to case, really. There are some players who are going to be ready at 17, 18 to go and play for Real Madrid, Chelsea, Liverpool, whatever. And there are players who will need a few more years to develop and to get used to being a star in their own league before going to the top 5 leagues or to the biggest clubs in the world. With Vitor Roque and Endrick, my very personal opinion is that they skipped some steps because they wanted to go and live that dream of playing for Barcelona and playing for Real Madrid.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not really the right time. If you look at Endrick's example, you see he's joining Real Madrid at the same time as Mbappe. You can't expect an 18-year-old to go and be Real Madrid's number 9 if you just sign Mbappe, and everyone knew at the time that Mbappe was going to join them. And with Vitor Roque is the same. He joined Barcelona in a time that they had Lewandowski, and even without those big number 9s, it's hard to expect a player that young and just being transferred for European football for the first time to just get there and play. So I understand the side of these players wanting to go and live their dreams and wanting to do as quick as possible, because you never know, if you get injured, you might lose a chance or whatever. But it's tough to expect a player that young to just go and play in the biggest clubs in the world. And I think that's very often the case with these youngsters here. And Brazilian football is very complicated because our calendar is very different from Europe, of course.
Yeah.
And we have the regional tournaments here from January to March usually. And these are quite important in the development of young players, because usually that's when the youngsters come up and start playing for the senior squads. And one day you are just one academy player, the next day you're like, maybe you're the best player we've ever seen play in that club. So everyone thinks you're a star. Everyone wants to see you in Real Madrid, in Liverpool, and big clubs in Europe. So, it's a very difficult argument. It's a big discussion here, but I personally think that most of these players tend to leave too early, just because they really are trying to go and get out there.
Well, the next one is a perfect example of that as well, right? Caio Jorge. He is back at Cruzeiro. He went at a very young age over to Italy, played at Juventus, was on loan at Frosinone. Santos, a youth development player, very interesting profile. Then went back in 2024 to Brazil. Didn't go back to Santos, went back to Cruzeiro, similar to Vitor Roque, who went back to a different club in Brazil, but went back regardless, and has since really thrived. His goal scoring statistics are very good. His market value before this update jumped all the way up to 22 million euros. You guys gave him another update, another 4 million euro update. He's now at 26 million euros, 24 years old. I mean, this is another guy who's come back and really thrived, and European clubs are probably going to think, this guy might be worth a second look.
Yeah, I mean, with Caio Jorge, the story is he's a much different player now than he was back then. And it was complicated when he left Santos because he was running the last few months of his contract. So Juve tried to get a good deal back then. And because he was negotiating with Santos, he saw the opportunity to go and join a top club in Europe. So he took it and went to Italy. But I mean, if you ask Caio today, he would probably say that he wasn't ready back then. And I personally think he wasn't ready back then. He just took the opportunity while he could, but today he's a much more mature player. You see his game style has developed much better here in Brazil than he was doing in Italy. And I mean, the way he plays for Cruzeiro today is like it's his team. He's the main guy for them. He's been one of the best strikers in the country last year. He seems to have been doing quite well this year as well. So he really earned that upgrades he's been getting in the last few updates. And he's one of the guys who, just like Vitor Roque, you expect him to be amongst players either on the World Cup or like on the radar for this World Cup or the next one, because Brazil really needs a number 9 today. There's a lot of uncertainty in surrounding the number 9 team in the national team. So I mean, it could be Vitor Roque, it could be Caio Jorge. These guys are showing that now they are ready. They are developing, and they are much different players than when they left. And I think that's a good example for some players that leave too early, that it's not the end for you if you leave and you can't do it in Europe. So that could be an argument for players who want to leave early, because they can still come back and turn the table around. But I think in these two examples for Vitor Roque and Caio Jorge, they are very, very good players who shouldn't have left that early, but now that they did and they come back, it's good for them that they're doing that well.
Yeah, the third one is Yuri Alberto, right, from Corinthians. He had a brief stint in Russia at Zenit. I believe he left around the time the war with Ukraine started, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and came back to Brazilian football. Then another Santos prospect.
Yeah, you see, it's very often that we talk about Santos when we
Yeah.
mention young stars here in Brazil. They obviously have a very good youth academy. And Vitor Roque, sorry, Yuri Alberto, he left for Zenit, and his case is quite different from Caio Jorge and Vitor Roque, because he did quite well in Zenit. But instead of joining like another mid-tier league in Europe or another mid-tier club, he chose to come back to Brazil. Obviously, he didn't want to be in Russians football anymore. So he came back to Brazil. He chose Corinthians, and since then it's been sort of a roller coaster ride with him. Corinthians fans will have mixed feelings regarding Yuri Alberto, because sometimes he's like the best number 9 in the country. Sometimes he misses a tap in and you don't know what's going on. But he has developed quite well in Corinthians, and for a couple of years now, he had the opportunity to join Premier League sides. He had some clubs from Europe interested in him, and for him, it's more a case of he's quite established now. I think if he wants to leave and if Corinthians wants to sell him, he definitely has some people keeping an eye on him in Europe. But yeah, he's another story of coming back to Brazil and continuing to develop. Of course, he was doing quite well in Europe, but yeah, since coming back, I think he's a much more mature player as well.
How much do you think the newfound wealth of Brazilian football keeps these guys maybe a little bit longer now in Brazil, or in these cases gives them the option to come back and develop? And it isn't like it used to be that a European team could just come in and sway these guys with bigger wages, because the money is good now in Brazilian football, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen in the last few years that the league has stepped up really in terms of salary, in terms of prize money, in terms of television money. So the clubs have much more money now than they did back then, not only to pay players, but to pay for players in the market as well. So you see Brazilian clubs starting to dominate in South America. You see the last, I think, out of the last 10 Libertadores titles, Brazil has won 8. And players want to be here. They want to be a part of this story. They want to win the Libertadores. They want to play for Flamengo, for Palmeiras, for Corinthians, and fight for titles here. And very often that means being close to your family, of course. That means being at your home country. And that means having a good salary as you would in a mid-tier team in Europe. So I think that's very interesting to see the moment Brazilian football is. And because clubs have more money now, they can not only offer better salaries for players, but they can build better squads. So players actually want to play with other good players here. And yeah, you see even players are discussing nowadays. You see Gabigol, for example, Gabriel Barbosa, who recently in a podcast said that he advised younger players in Brazil that don't leave to play in a small or a mid-tier team in Europe. Stay in Brazil and play for a big club and fight for titles here. It's not worth it. So, I mean, I think it's a matter of opinion, really, and point of view. But I think that the Brazilian league is really attractive right now for young players and for players who, even for older players who still want to play a bit. So you see big stars who are a bit older in Europe coming to play here. You see Memphis Depay, you see Jorginho, for example, very well-known players that chose Brazil over other leagues. And yeah, I mean, I think if you look into what clubs are now and compared to 10 years ago, for example, the Brazilian league has really stepped up and should probably be the best league we have outside the top 5 leagues, or arguably one of the best leagues in the world outside of the top 5 leagues.
I think it's wonderful to see, because that's where I was at when I was a kid, and then European football did what it did. But I want to highlight a couple of guys that are maybe not on people's radars yet, and they received their first market value. Stick with Corinthians first. André, midfielder, 19 years old, 60 million market value, first ever market value, right? That's a high entry, Marcos, for your first ever market value.
Yeah, I mean, how high is the ceiling for these young players, right? Of course, it's very complicated because, as I mentioned at the start of the football calendar here from January to March, these youngsters tend to like gain the spotlight, be under the spotlight, and people are like going crazy. Of course, a lot of it is hype on young players, as we know, but you have to analyze that these guys have a lot of potential. And if a player that young, like 17, 18, 19 years of age, gets to start for a big club like Corinthians, like Flamengo, like Palmeiras, there's something there for you to see. So when you go and analyze André's numbers, for example, he's a brilliant midfielder for a 19-year-old. He really plays senior level football like it's nothing. And it's been the case. There's one of his colleagues, Beno Bidon, is very similar to him. They don't feel pressure. Honestly, if you watch them play, it seems like they've been doing it for years now, and they're like 19, 20-year-old players dominating the midfield battles for Corinthians. So, I mean, André is definitely one to watch. He is linked to AC Milan. There's a bit of a transfer saga going on there because AC Milan wanted to buy him from Corinthians. There was sort of reportedly there was a deal closed around 15 million euro. The Corinthians stepped back. They don't want to sell him that low, if we can consider that low. And they want to develop him a bit more, have him play another year here in Brazil, and maybe in the future sell him for a higher amount of money for maybe AC Milan or another club in Europe, because they know for a fact that he now has the spotlight, and loads of clubs will be looking into him throughout the year. So yeah, I mean that's usually the case with young stars here that tend to shine on the beginning of the year, and if they continue to develop, clubs can always sell them for much higher fees at the end of the year.
I mean, that is a big factor on how we calculate market values. Transfermarkt, we're both area managers, right? We both very actively involved in our respective areas in determining market values. And if we see clubs being interested in players, that is a very big driver in setting those fees or setting the market values on our side.
Yeah, and I mean it's you should always consider what the market is doing in real life. I mean, what transfers are being discussed, what rumors we have surrounding these players, and especially when they are just starting their senior careers, you have to understand that it's difficult. That the less data you have to look into, the more complicated it is to assess these market values, and that's obviously a very important topic here. So in André's case, he played in last year's Série A in Brazil. He didn't receive a market value by December because we understood that he was a special case, and we should analyze him once he had a bit more of football being played at senior level. And it's often the case with these players that we give them time to develop and to really show who they are in senior level. And then we go as high as we can with the market values, and we try to assess them as realistic as we can. So, for example, you see rumors being around 15 million euros for André is obviously related to his market value being 16 million euros, and some other players as well that I'm sure we'll mention. We obviously consider what the market is doing but we try to analyze what data they have and how much potential they have as well.
Well, that's the next name that I thought was really curious, and you have to help me with the pronunciation. Grêmio's Gabriel Mec. Is it Mec?
Mec, yeah.
Mech. Okay, like a CH in English or German. 17. He receives his first market value ever. Has played senior football now in the Campeonato Gaucho, right, which is the regional competition, but also has featured in the Serie A. Attacking midfielder. Very interesting profile. You guys opted to go very high here as well with a first ever market value.
Yeah, I mean, Gabriel Mec is another example of a player that we've been watching for quite some time now. And we were sort of like just hoping and expecting him to play at senior level, because he has been for a few years been doing great for the youth national team of Brazil. He played last year a few games for Brazil's under-17 team, and he is like a very, very good player. But we sort of need to wait. We sort of need to see what the player is able to do at senior level before we can assess his market value. And we were just waiting for him to play a few games of Serie A, a few games of state championships as well. And now that we've seen how good he's managed at senior level, he's been like nominated man of the match a few times in the Gaucho this year. He's been doing his first few minutes in the Serie A as well. We thought it was time for him, even if he's only 17, to go and have his first market value. And I mean, the potential is written inside of those 12 million euros that we gave him. And to be very honest, when you see a guy like that, his first market value on Transfermarkt go that high, usually it means that there's a lot of potential there, but it also means that the player is already been doing well at senior level.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things that we found in our internal analysis before we going into this round of market value updates around the world is that potential is a big thing that drives market now, right? More so than ever, clubs are willing to pay big fees for players that are maybe still unheard of, right? They're willing to pay for potential, and that is, I think, that when I saw that name. And when we spoke about him for the text that is now online on all the English-speaking sites, that was one example where I thought, yeah, that's a typical case of where potential is really worth a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, just as we spoke a few minutes ago, if you think about it, clubs want to sign Brazilian players, star players from all over the world as soon as they can. So if they want a player that early so they can bring him to Europe and develop him in their own system, they obviously going to pay a potential fee or potential tax, let's put it like that, because they are not just buying the player for what he is right now, how he's performing now, but what he could be one day. And clubs selling players will try to push that as high as possible. So if they understand that a player has a high potential, has a high ceiling, they'll try to push his market value and his sale value as high as possible. So market values tend to reflect that, obviously. If a player's ceiling, a player's potential is that high, we need to go that high with its market value as well. And you see the clubs use that in negotiations as well, and they try to sell these young stars as high as they can if they're leaving that early.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating. Before we wrap this up, what are a couple names that we maybe didn't list in the article people should be taking a look on, especially ahead of the World Cup, right? But also as the Brazilian season is now really kicking off, we know that there's going to be, come the summer transfer window, a few names that maybe people didn't even have on the radar. So what kind of names should people pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely keep an eye on Breno Bidon from Corinthians as well. He's another top midfielder who's been doing well since he became a professional player for Corinthians. He was doing well at the youth teams as well. And I would keep an eye for the future on players like Del and Juan Pablo from Bahia, two very good forwards who tend to develop, especially when you think that Bahia is under the City group. They could develop quite well here and join other clubs in Europe and take the next steps with ease there. And yeah, keep an eye on Brazilian strikers. Obviously, those are always under the spotlight in international football. There's another good player to keep an eye on from Palmeiras is Alan, who is a very good midfielder. He can play a bit as a winger as well. He's going to be one for the future. I definitely know that there's teams keeping an eye on him from Europe. He should be joining European football quite soon because he's already 21 years old. Yeah, I mean, I would say nowadays you have to keep an eye out for everyone in the Brazilian league because you have stars all over the place. You have a mix of veterans who come from Europe who have been playing here for a while, and you have these young stars rising up inside of clubs.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you, Marcos. This was great. And yeah, if you want to find this update, it is all over Transfermarkt, whichever domain you prefer, whether it's the Brazilian one, .com.us, .co.uk, or whichever other language you use, the Brazilian market value update will be already on the site as we posted this last week. Yeah, great for having you on, Bud, and I'll talk to you very, very soon.
So Manu and I are now joined by Toby Kruger, who is Transfermarkt's market value analyzer, organizer, coordinator. Toby, we're not actually quite sure how we would define your job in the the translation from German to English, but the important thing is you keep an eye on all the big top leagues in Europe and all the minor ones as well. And you're here today to help us talk about the La Liga market value update. There were some really big stories in this. Obviously, La Liga has some of the biggest names in world football. I think it dominates the top 10 when it comes to the most valuable players in the league on our website. And I want to jump straight in with Jude Bellingham. He was probably one of the kind of biggest talking points from this market value update. His market value has dropped down to 140 million euro from 160 million euros. It's his second consecutive market value drop, Toby. And do you want to maybe just explain to people the reasoning behind that, what's going on with Jude Bellingham at Real Madrid, and I guess why he's maybe having a season to forget?
Yeah, with Jude Bellingham, you have to see the whole situation around him. When he came to Real Madrid, he was like the main player, scoring a lot of goals from attacking midfield, winning the UCL in the first real season. Having the Euros after that, where he played a big part in it. And now in the last month, he struggled a lot with the injuries with his shoulder, for example, who stopped him performing very well. But as we know, he's still a superstar, but his market value dropped in our opinion because he's not on the level he had like 2 years ago. And yeah, we will see how he comes back from his injury. He's now out with a hamstring injury, so it will be exciting to see also which role he can take at England for the World Cup, because now we have seen that the likes like Morgan Rogers, for example, breaks through in the last month. So his spot is not that clear in the team as it was at the Euros. So it will be exciting times around the corner soon.
That's exactly why I wanted to have you on the show today, because you can kind of draw those kind of links to players in other leagues. And as you said, Morgan Rogers is a good comparison to Bellingham at this moment in time. Manu, you wrote the article for us on La Liga. You spoke to Tobias Blaseo, who was our market value coordinator in Spain. When Bellingham left Dortmund, he was kind of seen as one of the best players in the world. He's seen as this world beater. Everyone said, yeah, Real Madrid makes perfect sense. But as Toby just said there, you know, the shines maybe come off a little bit, but also within the context of Real Madrid itself, you've got guys like Valverde, you've got Arda Güler, some other players as well. Perhaps even you could round that all up into like that attacking lineup, which has obviously had to shift to accommodate Kylian Mbappe this season as well. Do we think maybe the kind of spotlights came off Bellingham a little bit, as well as maybe his performances, but also he's no longer seen as the kind of exciting new thing at Real Madrid?
Yeah, maybe. I think, you know, you could really tell already last season, towards the tail end of last season, right, that the performances were dropping off. Even in his first year, we were both in at Wembley, right, when he won the Champions League with Real Madrid. And even then you could just kind of already tell it was dropping a little bit, his performances, from where he started. He had a red hot start at Real Madrid, was playing as a striker even at times and scoring a lot of goals. And it feels like he's never really was able to preserve those kind of performances long term at the club. You know, the deep impact player that he was at the very start, he is no longer. And it's really been like all of last year. Kylian Mbappe arrives last year, right? And Real Madrid don't have a good season at all. This year has been tumultuous again, with Xabi Alonso arriving and then being replaced by Viola. And throughout that, you know, Bellingham was brought in from Borussia Dortmund at a significantly high fee to be a difference maker and an impact player. And I really get the sense, having written this market value update, but also the couple before that, and speaking to Tobias Blaseo, that there's a real sense of kind of disappointment that he wasn't able to kind of maintain the high performance level he came within long term. And as a result, there is a significant drop of status at Real Madrid, as Blaseo called it. And I think that is really the thing that we need to emphasize here with Bellingham is, yes, his market value dropped from 160 million euros to 140 million euros. That's still really high. You know, that is still makes him one of the most valuable players on the planet. So we're talking about, I don't want to make it sound like this is a funeral or, you know, this is a guy who's going to drop off and no longer be a megastar. He still is, but I think he set Bellingham's big problem is, and I mean, Toby, you can give you 50 cents on this, but I get the sense his problem is that he set the benchmark so high at the start at Real Madrid that he has a really hard time kind of meeting that expectation now.
Yeah, I totally agree. As I said, his first season was near to perfect, with scoring that many goals and also important goals in the Clásicos and everything like that, winning the Champions League, for example. So, yeah, that's maybe the problem of all the big players. They come from such high standards that's really difficult to maintain, these performances and also the status. So you have always be near to perfect to stay at that level. And we've seen also now in other leagues like the Premier League, for example, a lot of superstars, like I would say, have some problems this year. So we go also from Wirtz to Palmer to Bukayo Saka. I think we are not in a season where superstars are making the real difference. It's more like a team-based performance in general. So maybe also we will see a better Bellingham next season, maybe, or really at the World Cup. But yeah, it's difficult to stay at this level when you got such a big or such a good start at Real Madrid like him.
Yeah, he's, as we said, there's still plenty of time for him to bounce back. You'll have the end of the season where I'm sure he'll still be challenging for trophies. And of course, as you said, Toby, the World Cup, where he'll probably be joined, well, no probably about it, he'll almost certainly be joined with colleague Trent Alexander-Arnold, who also had a minor market value drop. He dropped to 65 million euros from 70 million euros. By no means the biggest drop-off in the La Liga update, Toby, but I think that's also a slight indication of maybe, I don't know, struggles, the right word to use, maybe that's too strong, but perhaps a new signing for Real Madrid who hasn't, hit the heights that maybe we expect of him, having watched him play for Liverpool for so many years.
Yeah, I think joining Real Madrid is really the biggest step you can do as a player, as it's the biggest club in the world. And yeah, it sounds weird, but it's a different category, right? You have the club with the most ambitions, and you have to play also near to perfect every time. And then he also got a lot of players who can play there, as we also talked about Valverde at other times, who's like the perfect player who can play everywhere. And that's really tough. Also, captain sometime for Real Madrid. And then you have Carvajal, also a world-class player when he's there. And then when you struggle at the first in the first months or games or whatever, then it's really difficult to bounce back on that. And also Trent Alexander-Arnold has some injury problems this year. It's also you can't get into a momentum, for example, when you're still struggling after 6-7 games you did, when you're outside or out with an injury again. So it's not. He didn't had a good start, and it didn't get any better for now. But we all see the player he is, and I think when we give him some more time, I guess he will bounce back on that and will be a good top player again. So I think we shouldn't question his abilities as a player because he's not having a top first season at Real Madrid. So I think he's still also very interesting for the market, but we have to show the situation around him. So he got a downgrade, but I'm sure he will come back as a top player.
I mean, Manu, you spoke to Tobias Blasio about Trent Alexander-Arnold in particular, because obviously a lot of people in Spain, but outside of Spain, would want to know how he's getting on. And on the one hand, Toby's absolutely right. You know, he needs time to adapt. We have to give him, we have to have patience with these players. We can't be too reactive. But one thing that really stood out to me in what Tobias Blasio said to you was that he commented on his struggles defensively. And of course, the fact that he's, I know, as Toby mentioned, there are other players like Valverde who can step into that team, but to a large extent, Trent Alexander-Arnold is the guy who's been chosen to replace Dani Carvajal, who was it 5 or 6 Champions League trophies he's won with Real Madrid. You know, I think he's the most, if I'm not mistaken, he's the most decorated player in Real Madrid history, if you can believe it. And that's the kind of struggles that Trent Alexander-Arnold's having to deal with this season.
Blasio used the word, he was brought in to establish a generational transition with Dani Carvajal. So like a generational transition. Yes, this is the bar that he has to meet, right? It's extremely high. Carvajal, love him or hate him, you know, but he's a player who, as you said, has won a lot of stuff with Real Madrid. Countless trophies. Is still there too, right? That's another thing. In fact, against Man City, TAA was replaced by Dani Carvajal, right? So he's still there, kind of as lurking in the shadows, making sure that Trent Alexander-Arnold is doing a good job. And I think that is a really, really difficult thing to do as a player. To be, as you rightfully pointed out, how big of a club Real Madrid is in the world and how high the expectations are. If you know any Real Madrid fan you speak to, the expectations are to win every single game in the Champions League every year. And unlike other clubs that have similar expectations, they do meet those expectations most of the time. And that again means that if you're coming in from a club like Liverpool, who are probably just in that echelon below, right, where the expectations are also that you going to compete for the Champions League every year. I think that makes it almost more difficult because you come in like, yeah, I'm in a big club already. I understand what this is all about. And then I think when you talk to these players and you ask them, it's like, oh, what is it like? Then when you move to Real Madrid, oftentimes they will tell you like, wow, well, this was a lot harder than I thought it would be. Because, you know, the expectations are just at such a high level. And we just talked about Bellingham and how he set a high level for himself and wasn't able to quite meet it right away. And I think the same is true here with Trent Alexander-Arnold. He was brought in on a free transfer. He was brought in from a club where his status was extremely high at Liverpool, right? Being a Liverpool product. And now you have to kind of reestablish yourself at a club that you probably didn't think was as big as you imagine coming from a big club like Liverpool. And I can sense that with him, and having then of course also replaced Carvajal on top of that. So I think that is where we are kind of coming from, and that's also why, you know, when you are in charge of the market values in Spain and La Liga, you have to see it from that perspective, and that's why there's also, I think, a little bit of a downgrade. But I can also see that everything changes at Real Madrid if they win the Champions League. If they now knock out Man City and they go all the way to win the Champions League, then this downgrade will surely be just an afterthought at the end of the season.
I think there's also one thing we need to point out with the new role of Trent Alexander-Arnold, as we've seen him at Liverpool with some kind of role which made for him, like also with playmaking abilities and shoving into midfield and also more like into central midfield sometimes. But this role is not the Real Madrid role for a right back, more or less. So I think also just with everything he needs to adapt on beside of the pitch, and with the club itself, it also took he just took another role or need to take another role in the Real Madrid system. So it's a big change for him in any case. He did it last summer. Maybe it's something we all also in the valuation of this transfer underestimated in the last summer.
Yeah. Well, one player who has had some good news from this market value update, I promised there were some players who got upgrades, was of course Pedri at Barcelona, although I'm not sure Real Madrid fans will be delighted to hear that. He actually overtook Jude Bellingham, Toby, to move into joint second or third or fourth, depending on how you want to do your rankings, but he's just behind the players on 200 million euros. He moved up to 150. Talk to us a little bit about how he has kind of re-emerged, Toby, as such an important player for Barcelona, because we all know who Pedri is. We all know what he can do, perhaps more so for Spain than Barcelona, perhaps, at least from my point of view. But it definitely feels like this season he's beginning to really fulfill that potential. He's taken on a more important role at Real Madrid, at Barcelona. And that's why we've seen his market value rise by 10 million euros in this market value update.
Yeah, it gets more clear and clear that he's the engine of Barcelona from the midfield and will also be one of the engines of the Spain national team. And as I said, it's like Barcelona is maybe the second biggest club, as I told you before, that Real Madrid is on number one. And maybe also some Bayern fans.
I can already see the comments below. I can already.
But
your words, not ours.
Yeah, but also when you're playing for Barcelona, and maybe he's also the most coded La Masia player who never played for La Masia. He's everything you need in a number 8 or in a central midfielder, everything you want, and he's on that outstanding quality of a player. Then I think it's a good sign also for the market that he's on the same level as Vini, and it's also for us important to have him over Jude Bellingham right now. But as I said before, it can also change even when Bellingham comes back to his best form. So but Pedri, as I said, is everything you need in a central midfielder, and he's a really, really top player. And I think he also comes closer to Andres Iniesta, his idol. So he's on a very good way in that case.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I was about to mention the I word there, because Manu, that's exactly what Tobias Basile referenced in our article, our breakdown, our analysis of the market value update on the website. It's big shoes to fill. You know, we always joke about how when people get compared to Lionel Messi, it's like a death nail to their reputation, to their career. It's the last thing you hear about them before they just evaporate into nothingness. There's a Messi for every single nationality in football, it would seem. But, you know, Tobias Basile, our Spanish market value analyzers, rightfully says, this is the guy that Pedri has to more or less become. This is the guy he has to emulate. This is the guy he himself is obviously adores as a Barcelona player, as a Barcelona fan. But that's kind of what we're talking about now. And it's interesting because we just talked about how Trent Alexander-Arnold is perhaps struggling to fill those shoes left behind by Carvajal. But we've now got Pedri finally maybe kind of stepping into that role that left behind by Iniesta.
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, I think it's so good that you pointed out that he's not a La Masia player, Toby, because that's what everyone thinks, right? And they forget that he actually came through Las Palmas as youth academy.
And almost went to Bayern Munich, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, that is probably correct. I think Hassan Salihamidzic tried to sign him, right, before he went to Barcelona. And yeah, I mean, he's a player who I kind of almost feel how I'm going to put this the right way, because, and that is very Andres Iniesta of him, flies a little bit under the radar when you watch him play. His influence is not always 100% apparent right away. It's also similar to Andres Iniesta. His influence is far more apparent when you do not have him on the pitch, right? The drop off that the team will have when he's not there is almost more apparent than what he does on the field, because it's not measured in goals, it's not measured in assists. I mean, I look at the stats right now: 2 goals and 10 assists in 31 games. That's not mind-blowingly good, is it? But, it doesn't matter, because it's just such an important part of how Barcelona play. And especially under Hansi Flick this year, I think he's made an enormous step forward. And I think that is just, where this evaluation comes from. And so when I first, to kind of go take you guys behind the scenes a little bit, when I asked Tobias Blaseo about this text, writing this text, and then I look at the market evaluation and the sheet that's given to me when I pick out the players and where we want to talk about, and I saw Pedri at the very top. First of all, I was kind of thinking, really? And then you start thinking about and do your research on the player, and then you realize, okay, yeah, actually this makes a lot of sense. And but it's not something, he doesn't scream in your face, hey, I'm a world star, does he?
Yeah, but I think it's right what Manuel said. It's also like a player you really miss when you're not seeing him in your team, or when you just watch the game. For example, that's the player we want to see. But yeah, he's maybe he has not the superstar aura that I said Bellingham has, for example, but maybe he's overall the better player also. So yeah, but also it's very difficult to compare players like these, as they have players like this, like they have different strengths also, for example. But yeah, one thing I also wanted to point out with Pedri is that it's not long ago that he and Gavi were nearly on the same category, same stage, and then you can see what injuries can maybe have an impact on careers. As also Pedri is not, or it's not that he played injury free the whole time, but he always had like minor injuries, smaller injuries for most of the time. But Gavi has so many injuries that he's really trying to get back to this quality he already showed when he was younger. And he's still young, but in his first days at Barcelona. So we can also have two good examples for what injuries can do to your career, because Gavi got the next downgrade this case, and while Pedri is going to the top with his 150 million market value. So it's really, what's a good story for Pedri is also a bad story for Gavi, and it's really it's really bad how injuries affected his career. I just wanted to talk about that, because they were on the same level years ago, and I find it an interesting fact.
Yeah, Gavi was once valued at 90 million euros. I think I just had it open there, the summer of 2024, and he's now worth 30 million euros. So, yeah, that's a really important point. And as Manu says, Pedri's stats maybe don't jump off the page, but that's exactly why we don't use an algorithm at Transfermarkt. We use people, human beings with eyes and knowledge of football to kind of, obviously work on our market values. And I think Pedri's a perfect example of why that's so important, because as Manu says, he won't be topping any charts for goals or assists. And if Barcelona go on to win the Ballon d'Or, he might not even be a contender, although I suppose he probably would. But, it's always very important to remember the players who aren't maybe scoring the direct goals or the assists, but are, as Toby said, the engine of those midfield. Another player I wanted to briefly touch on before we let you go, Toby, is Antony at Betis. Now, everyone knows who Antony is. Everyone kind of knows what he's been up to over the course of his career. Some people watching this and listening to the show may have seen he left for Betis and forgot all about him. Especially if you're a Manchester United fan, you'd be forgiven for trying to focus on other things. But he had quite a significant market value upgrade, Toby, didn't he? Because he went from 30 to 40 million euros. And this is the first time in his career since he left Ajax that his market value is now back above where it was when he was at Ajax, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, was 35 million euros. And I guess that just goes to show, Toby, the remarkable turnaround he's had in Spain.
Yeah, he really had a turnaround. Like, as you said, the Man United fans made a mockery out of him. He wasn't taken serious in England, and then he came to Spain, to Betis, and it was a love story from the first day. And now he's going back and back to his best performances, or maybe or back to his Ajax performances, more or less. So he's on the way up. He rose again. And yeah, that's also a good case that you can also lose a lot of market value, but you can also regain it when you have the good performances or make a good career choice. And I think this choice to go to Betis was perfect for him. La Liga suits him, and now he developed into one of the best players of the league when you take out the big three, the Atletico, Real, and Barcelona players. Yeah, it's kind of remarkable that he's come back to where he is now. So that's a very good choice, his move to Betis.
Yeah, Manu, we could probably spend the whole day talking about players who have been chewed up by the Premier League. They go somewhere else and they finally begin to kind of show their true colours because they're given space and time to show what they're capable of, especially technically gifted players like Antony. Now, I think he had to contend with that physicality, which he hadn't really come to terms with at any point of his career before that. But he was also had the double whammy of being signed as, Eric Ten Hag's kind of favoured son, his chosen player. And when things didn't work out at Manchester United, a lot of the blame was thrown at Antony. But he's now moved to Betis. He's basically wiped the slate clean and he started from scratch. And as you wrote in the La Liga text, La Liga article, he's looking back to his very best, isn't he?
Yeah, it's his highest market value since August 2023. It's such an interesting case study of maybe don't jump into a certain situation right away. Looking back at how he played at Ajax, the style of football that Ajax played, granted with Erik ten Hag, that made him a really good player, was always going to be, I think, a struggle in the Premier League. We've seen this with other players too. Jadon Sancho comes to mind, who did really well in the Bundesliga, but the style of football in the Premier League is so very different than it is in other leagues. We can argue all day whether that's better or worse, but it is that is a fact. Not every type of player will be able to transition to that style of play. And I think Antony is a really good example of, hey, maybe going to Spain is actually a better idea for you, right? Because it's still a top 5 league. The football is very different. There is more emphasis on other things in terms of how you play your style of football. In fact, an argument can be made. That's why Jude Bellingham decided to go to Spain rather than the Premier League, because he was a player that was already having some physical struggles with injuries, etc. And, he himself decided that maybe Spain was actually a better option. That's career planning. Antony, I don't know if that was really the case here. And I think the other thing, and this is something that we often have to remember too, he's 26 now. A player at 26 is a completely different entity than someone in the beginning of the 20s. They have now experience. They had to deal with certain things. They had to deal with changing landscape, right? Going from Brazil to the Netherlands and then to England and now going to Spain. That matures you. And I think it's just a really good example of maybe don't give up on a player quite right away. And maybe if you're a player, I understand why they're always, careers are short. You maybe only get the chance once in your lifetime, but I think it's a really good example of be really careful what you choose to do in your next step in your career. Because, Antony, it's actually now working out with Real Betis, isn't it? But there's many players where the next step is even worse and we don't see the market value recover. It's a great story for him. I think this football suits him really well, and I think there's probably going to be a good market for him if he chooses to have a market. I think that is really going to be an interesting question as well. Is he actually going to maybe stick it out there because it is such a good situation for him? But yeah, I think it's a great story. It's one of the really good stories of this market value update that, that a player who had a really rough time in the Premier League, playing at a club that was in a difficult situation at the time as well, has now recovered his career and is looking like the star that he was at Ajax.
Yeah, I mean, before we wrap up, Toby, it was probably worth throwing that to you actually, because you obviously keep an eye on the market value trends across European football as a whole. And when you look at a player like Antony, who has bounced back, who's very quickly adapted to Betis tremendously well, do you think as a market value analyzer, okay, this guy is now put himself on a stage where he can then go on to an Atletico Madrid, a Valencia, or perhaps even a Real Madrid or Barcelona, if he can really kind of show that he's truly thriving in La Liga, or perhaps even, return to Brazilian football where there's a lot more money these days? Is that the next stage now for Antony and his market value if he can continue these performances?
I think he can get more upgrades if he maintain his performances right now. But I also think he will have a market in the summer. There will also be a World Cup. I think he has good chances to play there. And then also with his style of football, you can he can always create some special moments. And then we also saw in the history of World Cups, a special moment at the World Cup is really valuable on the market. So I guess he will have some opportunities. Also, there were also rumors with Atletico Madrid, for example, and maybe Simeone is also one coach he can get even more out of him. But I think Manuel also said this. Maybe it's also a fact that he should just, think for himself and think maybe Betis is such a good club for me and everything works well. So I don't think every player is made for having a move like every transfer window, and sometimes just a combination is that good that maybe you should just rest in this situation and just stay at your club. And I think Betis is also a good team and also a great club, always playing in Europe. Last year, Conference League finalist, and now in the Europa League. So I don't really think he needs to move. He can also be a great player in La Liga for Betis and for the Brazilian national team, for example, without moving the clubs in the summer.
Yeah, I suppose if he and Betis continue what they're doing, he could end up facing Manchester United, maybe in the Europa League next season. But definitely a player to keep an eye on going forward, because as Toby says, we don't know what could happen in the coming months, and maybe 4 or 5 months down the line, we're talking about Brazilian World Cup winner Antony fighting off bids from around European football, and it wouldn't have been the craziest thing that's ever happened in football. But Toby, we've already taken up too much of your time. Thank you so much for helping us break down all the La Liga stuff. And as I said, nothing gets done at Transfermarkt when it comes to market values without Toby pulling out his rubber stamp and giving it the sign of approval. So we'll definitely have you back on the show very soon to talk about all the other leagues. And as I said, how they all kind of coalesce into one and the growing trends between them. So thanks very much for joining the show today.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here.